From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. This week, Dan compares current grain bids at local Kansas elevators to forward contracts on 2022 production at those same locations as an indication of market direction. And he talks about the potential market impact of that new soybean crush plant to be built in southeast Kansas. Following then is K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti. He'll look at the pace of soybean crop dry-down right now, given the cooler and wetter weather recently. He'll tell what you producers can expect based on previous studies of soybean dry-down rate. And K-State's Chip Redmond is standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us once more. That's our lineup on this Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Good to have you aboard once more. Well, the grain markets are working off of another USDA report earlier this week and are responding in according fashion to the numbers. We'll pick up on that and talk about some other developments this week, likewise, with grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension from his office in Colbeat, Northwest Kansas. So the markets had, Dan, something of a hard time getting past that World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report on Tuesday, with the exception of the wheat complex. What were your takes from that report?
Well, positive wheat with the projected ending stocks for this marketing, you're breaking below 600 million, with a stocks to use figure for U.S. wheat projected to be at, again, below 30%, down to 28.5%. That's compared to 40% last year. That's certainly a major influence on the wheat market, along with several international sets of numbers coming into consideration there too. The reverse situation for corn and for soybeans, as the USDA didn't indicate that there were any shortfalls in production for either of those crops. The corn stocks to use figure was raised, but projected stocks to use ending stocks at 1.5 billion bushels, again with a little bit of a small increase in the yield per acre. It wasn't many bushels, but you cracked the barrier of 15 billion. You only changed 22 billion bushels, but still now it's 15 plus instead of 14.9 something. So kind of a little bit of psychological situation as it affects the market. Then for soybeans, raised the production figure up to 4.448 billion bushels, up 74 million bushels. Yields up to 51.5. Average projected yield for the United States, 51.5 bushels per acre, up 0.9 of a bushel. So we're in the harvest time, and when there aren't any surprises coming into the market psyche that indicate that we're going to have a major shortfall, then this is where we're at. By the way, the ending stocks figure with all the supply-demand balance sheet in play for soybeans increased from about 180 million bushels up to 320, still tight. Stocks to use 7.3%. So now we sit with combines rolling, harvest well underway, some rains, slowing things down a little bit, but nothing major. We also are getting some rains for seeded hard red winter wheat in Kansas and in the plains. So that's generally positive. So we have this information all coming in, none of it showing a major crop shortfall. But then you see, well, after that's taken into account, then where do we stand for the futures? Well, D's corn closed yesterday at $5.16 3/4. Yes, that's down, but it's still well over $5. November soybeans, $12.06. And yeah, we've been seeing $13, $14 lead futures contracts all the way through this year. D's hard red winter wheat at $7.31. I think we have a lot of uncertainty that will have to be dealt with in these markets this year going forward. I guess my own attitude towards a moderation in price, it's still at tremendous prices, is that we're best off in terms of a economic sustainability sense if we have farmers getting good yields and good prices, and our using industries, be it ethanol, be it livestock feeders, be it export markets, if they're able to buy at a reasonable price, then we're able to keep going and to have a a well-functioning integrated supply chain that maintains these markets over time. We don't want to kill off the usage industries with extremely high prices, or then everybody suffers at the backside, both the producer and the users. So and the processor. So I think right now it's kind of amazing. We're sitting at prices that 1 or 2 years ago for corn, for soybeans, for wheat that we would have just dreamt of. Now we're sitting there, and if anything, we're a little bit subdued because those prices are off the highs that we'd had.
Dan, you say you've gone to the trouble this week of taking a closer look at our current cash delivered prices in Kansas and have compared those to forward contracting opportunities here in the state, and that tells something of an interesting tale. Share that if you would.
Spot cash prices at this harvest compared to what's projected for forward contract bids for next harvest. Let's just pick out a location. In Garden City, the spot cash price, 501, projected cash price in that same region for harvest 2022 is the same number, 501. So that's not indicating that they have in the bank that we're going to have a tremendous crop year in 2022. You're still seeing a really strong forward contract bid for next year. But generally, that's probably one of the better locations in the state in terms of that relationship. You look at Salina, 517 cash, about 481 for a new crop bid, $5 per bushel in Topeka, 481 again for bid next year. Kind of shifting spotlight to grain sorghum. The strongest cash bid we're seeing in the state, at least that I found, was at Topeka, $5.42 for grain sorghum. At that location, the forward contract bid for next harvest is $4.56, still a tremendous price. But actually, the highest forward contract bid for next year, fall 2022, I'd found in the Hutchinson area, $4.86. Cash price there, $5.22. Soybean prices, again, we're not 13 or 14, but at midst of harvest, we're looking at a range of 1102 low at Garden City to a high of 1176. In Hutchinson, 1171 in Salina, 1164 in Topeka. So decent prices, but if the reference point or the higher prices we just had at harvest, we've come down off of that considerably. And then for wheat, it's interesting to see the current cash price for wheat and where the new crop bids are at. The current cash price for wheat, $6.95 in the Colby area, top price available that I could see, but the new crop bid price is basically the same, $6.96. So for sure, with hardwood winter wheat, we don't have that new crop bid in the bank. Hutchinson area, 711 current bid, 716 for new crop. So just interesting.
Well, Dan, the news came out earlier this week that a major regional grain handling firm has intentions of opening a large capacity soy crush plant in southeast Kansas, in Montgomery County. And this will be a sizable project by all accounts, so wanted to ask you how you perceive this development and the implications for soybean producers in southeast Kansas, most assuredly, but for the state as a whole.
It increases competition to have active processors. There's more to the story than just having another plant there that fills a gap between what exists. I think in Emporia there's a plant. We mentioned there's our plant in Wichita.
Yes.
So here you have another location. Port of Catoosa down there was this active demand pull source, has been for a while for soybeans. So here you have this gap there. I believe in history back in 2005 there may have been another plant in the Fredonia area, but you want to double check that. So here we're having another plant built there. But there are new soybean crush plants being built in various areas around the United States, up in the Dakotas, soybean crush plant, canola crush plant. I think one of the economic motivators for these plants to be built is the increase in renewable diesel that's anticipated in the United States. Technologies there supported generally by the renewable fuel standard as it looks at on the soy oil renewable fuel side. And you look at the U.S. soybean oil supply-demand balance sheet that came out of the October 12th WASDE report, and you look at biofuel use of soybean oil in the 2020-21 marketing year. Look at the increase from 8.8 billion pounds used this last year, projected to increase to 11 billion pounds in the 21-22 marketing year that we've just entered into. And you're seeing this growth in U.S. biofuel use of soybean oil hitting that renewable soy diesel market. Then you'll have competition for what's available for U.S. soybeans to be used either for export or for crush. And to the degree we grow that, all that much more, then soybean crush takes on probably even a greater proportion. It's almost a domestic U.S. insulation of the demand and usage of soybean oil. And you're looking at a situation not too dissimilar to the feed grain markets, to where about a third or so, 35%, somewhere in there, of U.S. corn now used domestically in biofuels. So not a bad thing at all.
Do want to mention here that Dan will be part of a special event taking place tomorrow here on the Kansas State University campus. It'll be a Grain Market Outlook Forum, which is a part of the Commodity Tailgate taking place at the IGP Center here on campus. It's hosted by the major grain commissions here in the state for wheat, for corn, for grain, sorghum, and soybeans. Dan will be joined by Guy Allen and Alan Featherstone of K-State for that round of discussion, and we'd certainly invite anyone and everyone to take part in that. It'll get going at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Once more, the IGP Center just across Kimball Avenue from Bill Snyder Family Stadium. You can find out more about this in detail at kscorn.com, kscorn.com. Dan, a pleasure as always. We'll talk again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien with us, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, on the grain trades here on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and next up for you, soybean harvest considerations, as we're joined via phone by Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And what we want to center on largely here, Ignacio, is the dry-down rate of soybeans ahead of harvest, noting that we're about a third of the way done with soybean cutting in Kansas. So some things could be happening here that are important to producers.
Yes, I always thanks, Eric, for the invitation to talk about this. We are moving quite fast on the harvest, and one of the things that we always need to think and look ahead, these weather conditions that we're expected to have for in the next coming weeks, it will be really critical for finishing and making sure that we have a good soybean seed at the end of the season. And I think that one of the main challenges that we have in the next coming weeks, and we already experienced some this week, lower temperatures connected to moisture. In some of these situations, if you start looking at dry down, on soybeans that dry down, it goes quite fast. But it might take significant amount of time if we start seeing these changing patterns. As we experienced this week, we went from being extremely warm all the way to being cold and wet. And I think that the patterns that we are expecting to have on the coming weeks really will define what the possibilities that we have in terms of really cutting those soybeans and really our goal is to try to target that 13% or close as possible to make sure that we maximize that kind of a seed moisture at harvest.
Right. The weather conditions are definitely an influence here. The lower temperatures now, some moisture around and about Kansas. The maturity group that one is growing does figure in here as well, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, everything that you can think about that is changing your season, like a planting date or maturity group, all those factors, I mean, that you are selecting a plant early in the season are really defining what is the conditions that this crop will enter into seed filling. And most importantly, what are the conditions where the crop will enter into what we call the dry down. I mean, usually soybeans will reach maturity with a high water content in the seeds. Usually they will reach that maturity sometimes between 60 or 50% of water content. And then from that moment on, 50-60%, we are waiting on that dry down all the way to 13%, which is our optimal conditions for harvesting. That rate of dry down depends on the maturity group because it depends how late the crop is reaching to that basically maturity or black layer. Depends on the planting day, as we mentioned before, because if we plant in too late, we are placing that condition in a worse environment, so that could be also another complication. And then the last factor that we just discussed depends on the weather conditions. So if we enter in a pattern of lower temperatures, as we are experiencing now these days, and going into cold, wet conditions like this wet, dry down pattern, in many situations we can just fluctuate on dry down. So to give you an example, that seed can go from 50 to 40%, and could happen very fast. I mean, in many situations, dropping of seed water content usually can be around 3% of drying down per day in some scenarios. But you can also gain moisture. It's not all the time that you are drying down, but also you could gain moisture. So we have seen situations where we have excellent dry down conditions. We get to close to 13% in some situations, and then farmers, they go out the following day after rain or cold weather, and they found that they are probably close to 16, 17. So they were gaining like 3 or 4 points up. And that is a common situation, and it happens during the entire process of dry down, because that dry down doesn't depend on the plant. That the dry down depends specifically on the weather conditions. And if the weather conditions are changing, and if we go into these patterns of being dry, wet, most likely we will start seeing that similar pattern of drying for a few points, losing a few points until harvest, and then again, what we call the re-wetting process. So the seeds, they start to basically gain moisture from the rain conditions or from basically the high humidity.
That very well may be where a number of producers are as we talk here, with these rains this week, adding back to that moisture content. And how does one get a good read on that, or can they, Ignacio?
I would say the best case scenario is keeping on really, really trying to get a hold onto the seed moisture, because one of the things that I always remind to farmers is that in the best weather conditions, when the soybean was maturing on mid-September, we could probably went all the way from that maturity, from that day of 50-60% of seed water content, all the way to 13% in 15 days only. Today, for that same process, it might take longer. Most likely it could take, in some scenarios, maybe 2 points or 1.5% of decrease per day. So we are talking about sometimes it might take 20 days or 25 days. So we really need to keep on the look, because we can go, as we're going really fast early in the process with good temperature, but we can now start going really slow if we move into the situation with the weather conditions that they are high precipitation, in situations that we have less wind, and situations that we have cold temperatures. And everything that was maturing late, entering to maturity the first week of October, is probably the one that is on the worst shape at this point.
The key figure to keep in mind there, if you need a benchmark, producers, the research has shown that soybeans will dry roughly 3% per day if all stays normal. We didn't talk about it, though, the consequences, Ignacio, of harvesting soybeans too wet. Well, that can be a problem.
In both, I would say both sides. The side of harvesting too wet probably has presenting more challenges from the machinery and operation equipment. Mm-hmm. We have seen many situations on these green stems where the plants are really wet and the stems are still too green. So unless you go too slow, we have a lot of issues on operationally how to harvest the seeds. Then you have the other opposite side, that many guys harvesting with a very low moisture. Some guys, were harvesting with 9-10 points. Mm-hmm. So it just takes only 3 or 4 days, in some situations even less, with excellent conditions, not as the ones that we have seen today. But it could take just a few days to move to harvest. And then, unless you're on top, most likely you are not maximizing that harvesting, total harvesting volume. And we emphasize this point all the time, because in many situations, moving from 13% of moisture to 11 or 10% of moisture, that could represent, just by not harvesting on time, $10 to $15 per acre, basically lost on not doing that. And of course, that loss depends on basically the dry matter that you are and the volume that you are just not selling, and then also depends on the price of the crop. So in this situation, it's just a rough estimate, but gives you an idea that there is a loss. And there is something that if you are not on top, most likely you are not maximizing your profits.
Once again, producers, be on top of this, inspect your fields regularly, and look for the signs that would indicate to you those beans are approaching that preferred range of 12-13%, right in that ballpark. Either side of that could be a difficulty for you. And before we let you go, just a general observation, if you would, Ignacio. Considering our weather of late, how are we with our soybean crop in Kansas? What have you seen around as far as the overall prospects for good yields out there?
I think that we are faring in many situations very well. I was surprised in many fields that we were at least very challenging early in the season on establishing the crop. But in many situations, we are faring really well. In fact, in some of the fields that I was looking, we have seen, even on the high-yielding side, we have seen some high-yielding records. So overall, I think that we'll have an excellent growing season. But we really need is just, we have a very warm September, so that was really helping us. Compared to the last couple of years, our September was quite unique. And I think that was basically an excellent condition, although a little bit dry, but really maintaining the crop, maintaining that kind of a seed weight. So we are seeing some yields that are quite high, but specifically because we were able to maintain that and maximize the seed weight at the end of the season. So overall, we are seeing fair yields. Potentially concern could be things that are maturing right now, all the late planted or double crop. And then if you start looking at the conditions of temperatures on the next coming weeks, we will start seeing that pattern of 2 or 3 days of dry conditions and then rain, and then temperatures that are below, good for this time of the year, but still low. So, and then the dry down and really maximize the volume that we're selling. It will be one of the complications for those basically soybeans that were planting too late and they were maturing basically close to early or mid-October.
Well, producers, be aware of that dry down rate, the likelihood of those beans getting to that optimum moisture percentage. Ignacio, thanks as always for your input. We'll talk again later on.
Thanks as always, Eric, for the invitation.
Crop Production and Cropping Systems Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That's Ignacio Ciampitti. And you are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and for this weekly glance now at Kansas agricultural weather, as we're in touch once again with meteorologist Chip Redmond of K-State Research and Extension. He is, of course, with the Weather Data Library here at the university. There was rainfall, to be certain, in Kansas the past several days, and what do you have for us in the way of a moisture recap this time, Chip?
Yeah, we had really good rainfall, especially for those in the central and east part of the states. And we go back just a couple more days, even most of the west saw rainfall as well. Over the last 7 days or so, we had rain up to 4 to 5 inches. It's focused usually in the Flint Hills there, the little corridor from Butler County northeast to, about Leavenworth or Jefferson County. As you get further west, the precipitation tapered off. But the good news is most areas that really need it, especially in that southeast where we saw flash drought develop, got it. The one exception to the rule was the far southwest. They did not really receive much as a tenth to a couple hundredths out there in Morton County and Hamilton County. So it wasn't uniform across the state, but most of the people got in on some rainfall.
And it is definitely cooler fall weather now. And in fact, you say that Mesonet has recorded the first freeze of the season.
Yeah, breaking news. As of Thursday, October 14th, Oberlin and Norton, Kansas Mesonet stations recorded 4 and 2 hours below freezing, respectively. So a first freeze has been noted in Kansas. That we also had obviously some frost out in a larger area But, we recorded our first freeze. That's about a week for that area, up to 2 weeks later than average for that area. So we're actually running a little bit behind. Right now, the middle of the state, basically, from the southwest, draw a line diagonally to the northeast, the average first freeze for that corridor is now. So we're running a little bit behind, and tonight and Saturday morning, we'll see potentially another opportunity for isolated freezes and some frost, and then it looks like we get warmer.
Which we want to talk about, but before we get into the outlook, to mention that tool that's available on the Mesonet website directly for the purpose of tracking those freezing events, the Freeze Monitor. Remind us of what that is and what it does, Chip.
Yeah, if you go to the Mesonet website, click the menu in the top left, you can click Weather, and then the Freeze Monitor, and that will bring you up to the hours below 32 degrees. So you can look at how long the most recent freeze, how long that freeze lasted until they got above normal. You can also look at temperature thresholds as we get later in the winter, as well as 24 degrees and 12 degrees, which are concerns for the wheat crop. And you can also look at how many days it's been since the last freeze. So I pulled it up, and as of October 14th, the last freeze we saw in the state was 153 days ago, so about the middle of May. And so the growing season this year was about 150 to about 175 days, and we'll add on a few days for some areas over the next couple of weeks.
We'd encourage folks to take full advantage of the information that tool provides at mesonet.ksu.edu. And the forecast to date looks like we're going to have relatively dry weather ahead and seasonal temperatures. Is that fair to say, Chip?
Yeah, the upcoming week, we might have another chance of rain midweek next week, but overall below average precipitation. So as much as we enjoyed the rainfall we got, we're going to dry out again, and we'll see favoring warmer than normal temperatures through that period as well. Looking into November, I just don't see a huge cold air outbreak coming anytime soon. And unfortunately, don't see a huge rainmaker like we saw last week either.
Well, we've a fair amount of fall harvest yet to be finished up, so there's the upside of that open weather forecast. Chip, many thanks to you, and we'll talk again next Friday.
Sounds great. Thank you.
That's K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond on Kansas agriculture weather. A good weekend to you. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.